The largest country in the world is full of secrets. Russia. Once it was the empire of the Tsars. In the middle of the forest of Yekaterinburg, a city in the Ural Mountains, there is a chapel. Every Sunday, monks pray for forgiveness here for a crime that has cast a dark shadow over Russian history. The assassination of Tsar Nicholas II and his family. After 23 years on the throne, he was forced to abdicate in 1917. He's on record of saying, "Oh my goodness, I never was prepared for this." But I think he must have known for months before what was going to happen. The royal family were put under arrest. Night of the 17th of July 1918, they were torn from their beds and taken to a cellar on Lenin's orders. On the whole, I think that Russia was destined to lose the monarchy. They had an idea of what lay ahead. In German, writing on the wall of their Yekaterinburg dungeon had a quote from Heinrich Heine. Belshazzar was killed by his servants that very night. You kill a president for political reasons, but a whole family? No, come on. You don't do that. But they did that. Royal dynasties, the Romanovs. The Romanov Empire, the Tsarist dynasty who ruled over Russia for 3 centuries. Their unimaginable wealth can still be seen today in the splendor of their residences. Myths and legends surround the once powerful royal family, whose fate was sealed almost 100 years ago. It was a subject that was taboo for so long. Nobody discussed it. It was dangerous if you were seen to be showing too much interest. The whole thing was doomed from so far back. So it was a tragedy with a long, long tail. Today, 60 descendants of the Romanovs live scattered all over the world. Many went into exile in Paris. Like Xenia Sefiris, a grandniece of the last Tsar. The Tsar's sister was able to escape with her family. They are the descendants of the Grand Duchess Xenia of Russia.
As my family traveled a lot before the revolution, they had houses everywhere. And these houses were treasures with all their interiors, the furniture and paintings. After they fled to France, they were able to sell a lot of it and make a very good living.
The youngest generation only knows the past of their ancestors through stories and from the pictures they have left behind.
We tell the girls a bit about the family history, but not much yet, little by little.
The Russian ancestors include Peter the Great, the star of the family, Catherine II, also Catherine the Great, who was actually German, and Tsar Nicholas II, last Romanov Tsar on the throne.
Mum keeps saying that it has to be important, that it is important.
The most significant was probably Peter Romanov. He ascended the throne in 1682. He wanted to lead his country into the modern age and posthumously became Peter the Great. The artist gave him delicate features. This was flattering. Peter was a giant of a man who, at a considerable 2 meters tall, sometimes frightened his contemporaries. He also sometimes came across as wild and unwashed. Politically, he was also unruly. Peter the Great had a certain symbolic effect because he tried to reshape the country from scratch so that it could become a world power. He was convinced that he had to do this because he had travelled through Central and Western Europe on the Grand Embassy of 1697 to 98 and had gained a very profound insight into how societies and states functioned elsewhere. Travelling educates. Peter took this to his heart. He travelled undercover, but not alone. His entourage consisted of more than 350 companions, including aristocrats, guardsmen, clergymen, 6 trumpeters, 4 dwarfs, and a monkey. They travelled via Königsberg and Berlin to Amsterdam to the shipyard town of Zaandam. The very day after his arrival, a certain Peter Mikhailov got a job as a carpenter at a shipyard. He brought his own proper work clothes and tools himself. It's ludicrous. A fabulous, crazy, ludicrous story. In any case, it was a huge undertaking to take out the elites, so to speak, and travel to Western Europe, to see how they lived in the West, to engage in a sort of industrial espionage and also cultural espionage. A bit like how the Chinese came to Europe 10 or 20 years ago with a camera in hand, and you would always wonder why they took photos of door handles or light switches. They just wanted to take in everything around them. And now you go to Shanghai and think, oh, that's why they did it, because they wanted to copy everything. That's what Peter the Great was like too. His journey continued to London, where the king granted the Romanov accommodation in Kensington Palace. And he lived in, actually, funnily enough, I think in this part of the building. This is an older part of the building than the rest of it. He sort of came here to see how ship design went so he could build a good Russian navy. This was because Peter wanted to turn Russia into a naval power, Russians into sea dogs. Peter the Great and his people used to drink an awful lot. They used to drink brandy with peppers. Sounds disgusting. And one day, he wanted to go to Oxford. Oxford heard about his reputation, and they wouldn't let him come. This man is a disaster. So he never went to Oxford. But he was certainly here, and he did learn a great deal about the building of ships. With his head full of ideas, Peter returned to Moscow in the summer of 1890. Now he wanted to rebuild all of Russia immediately and radically. A visible sign of this desire for reform was that the beards had to go. Peter hated this hairy image of Russianness, this reminder of a bygone era. He ordered the people to dress in German and French fashion. He had his favourite toys built based on a Western European model, 380 warships. There's just one little problem. He had no ice-free access to the sea. That's why Peter waged war against the Swedes who ruled the Baltic coast in the northwest for the moment. Peter conquered the eastern tip of the Gulf of Finland and had a stronghold built there in 1703. St. Petersburg, the new capital of the Tsarist Empire. Peter's greatest ambition was to turn the Russians into Europeans. St. Petersburg was a city that stood for everything European. We wanted to be like Paris, we wanted to be like London. But this model, so to speak, was the opposite of the other model, this Ivan the Terrible image of Russia. And it is precisely these two perspectives that have preoccupied every Russian ruler since Peter the Great. Those who follow current Russian politics will be able to see parallels to times long ago. The Kremlin, once the residence of the Tsars, is President Putin's seat of residence today. Russia takes influence from the traditions of the Romanovs in its symbols too. Since 1993, the flag has once again been white, blue and red, a souvenir from Peter the Great from Netherlands. Putin has an interest in a strong and great Russia, in being a player in world politics. In this desire to assert Russia as a global power, there are certainly similarities to what Peter the Great wanted, but it isn't in any way a conscious link to any form of Tsarist tradition. Rather, the interest in a great identity-creating narrative that concerns Russia as a whole. It is a heritage that Russia is once again proud of today, the grandeur of a past that also inspires improvement. A German woman also made a career on the Tsar's throne. Catherine the Great. What she achieved for Russia was exceptional. Although she originally wasn't meant to be, being from the family Zerbst. And not many people that even know how to pronounce Zerbst. Catherine was born a daughter from the small, impoverished German royal house of Arnheld Zerbst. But her fate changed abruptly. Through the meditation of Frederick the Great, she was married in 1745 to Peter, heir to the Russian throne, but the marriage was not happy. Peter was obsessed with the military, an admirer of Prussia and an infantile eccentric who played war games with toy soldiers. Catherine read Voltaire and studied constitutional law. The couple soon went their separate ways, among talk of infidelity, also of a political nature. There were relevant elite representatives who also held high positions and realized it was much easier to discuss political matters with Catherine than with Peter, and they began to back her. Peter became Tsar in 1762. Then he threatened Catherine with divorce and a lifelong stay behind convent walls. Catherine forged a plot. She enlisted all the regiments of the Royal Guard on her side. 6 months after her rise to the throne, Peter was deprived of his power. A week after that, he was dead. Also, Catherine was feeling not very safe. She had probably a party with her friends and she probably said, "Ah, what a bore my husband is. I wish I could just get rid of him." They thought she meant, and he disappeared out of the way. Catherine claimed neither to have ordered the murder or to have known about it, but she profited from it. For 34 years, she determined the fate of the country as Catherine II. She reformed the vast empire, but in doing so, lost sight of her subjects. A century later, around 90% of the Russian population still toiled in the countryside, half of them serfs. They were treated as slaves by the ruling landlords. The Russian people had never been asked to discuss what the monarchy meant or what democracy or constitutional monarchies were. Alexander II actually faced the problem, and he had the decree signed for the first little step, a tiny step forward to create local responsibilities for administering the country. Alexander II reigned from 1855. He wanted to put an end to the oppression of his people and free his empire from the stigma of barbarism. Even in the mid-19th century, exploitation and despotism were still the norm. People were starving. Tens of thousands died. He saw the need to move with the time. He saw the need, for example, to abolish serfdom and to bring some kind of democracy and some kind of parliamentary institution into the Russian makeup. Alexander abolished the serf system in 1861. He reformed the court system. For the first time, Russia experienced a balancing of power. At the beginning of his reign, he introduced the concept of glasnost, political transparency into the debate. By this, he meant freedom of opinion, which led to an explosion of public opinion on how Russia should develop. And Alexander II, although he was a reformer, was then seen as a symbol of the old system. For many people, he didn't go far enough. Secret societies formed which blamed the Tsars for all the country's problems. One of these groups called themselves the People's Will. Its member had one goal: the assassination of the Tsar. For weeks, the terrorists watched the ruler's every move, learning. On the 13th of March, 1881, they struck. The bodyguards were seriously wounded, with one passerby killed. Alexander, however, emerged unharmed from his carriage. He wanted to help the victims. A young man stood in his way, just a few steps distance from him. With Alexander's death, the reforms also died. He was the best Tsar we had. So, the great mistake was abandoning what Alexander II began. Nobody is ready for a change, but you have to make an effort. And I think that, on the whole, Russia was destined to lose the monarchy. Alexander's grandson, Nicholas, had to face the challenge of leading the monarchy into the 20th century. He was the head of the empire from 1894, the 17th Tsar from the Romanov dynasty. He ruled as an absolute monarch, like all his predecessors, but Nicholas II did not feel comfortable in his role.
He was not a political man at all. He became Tsar because he had to. From then on, he did his job, but against his will. It was absolutely not what he wanted to do, but he was also under his wife's thumb. He did everything to please her.
Nicholas married his childhood sweetheart Alexandra, a German princess from the House of Hesse. But Alexandra was neither popular at court nor amongst the public. It was mostly due to the fact that the Empress was an Anglo-German princess without any true knowledge of Russian history and the Orthodox faith. Alexandra gave the Tsar 4 daughters. The sisters Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia spent much of their time with their parents and their cousins.
The cousins were good friends. They saw each other regularly. Because my grandfather was married to the niece of Nicholas II, the families were very close. Tsar Nicholas was my grandparents' best man. They saw each other at parties and on outings together, and invited each other to birthdays. They led a life much like you or I. The children actually had a very normal life.
It all seemed perfectly happy when, in 1904, the longed-for son was finally born, heir to the throne, Alexei. But the little Tsarevich suffered from a hereditary disease. He was a haemophiliac. Even small wounds were life-threatening for the boy.
The poor mother. When she learned that she was the cause, that she had passed Queen Victoria's illness on to her son, how could she forgive herself for that? It changed her whole life.
Internal bleeding, aggressive medication. The boy often had to go through immense pain. He was looked after day and night by bodyguards. And the little boy fell and hurt himself on his side. He had an internal bleeding which made him suffer frightfully, and the doctors could not find a way of calming him down. And he actually said, "Mother, I want to die." Imagine a mother hearing her son saying that. In her distress, the Tsarina turned to a man who was considered to be a miracle healer. So she sent a telegram to Rasputin. The answer was very simple: pray to God and send the doctors away. She did that, and the boys started getting better. Rasputin, a Siberian savior. His effect almost hypnotic, especially on women. So, of course, they were fascinated to have this man around them, who had never washed in his life, with his bright eyes, who ate with his hands and threw the bones behind him, who spoke so coarsely. For them it was like, wow, this must be the original Russian. The mythical Rasputin, hardly any other Russian figure, has been the subject of so much speculation, films, hit songs and rumors. A Siberian farmer's son from the poorest background who made a career as a traveling preacher. The Tsarina also saw him as a messenger of God. From today's perspective, we would say, how can they have fallen victim to such a nutcase? The main reason, of course, why the Tsarina suddenly listened to this Rasputin was because she was simply a very desperate mother who just wanted her son to be helped. And then one of her ladies-in-waiting came along and said, "Oh, the latest hit. Haven't you heard of Rasputin? He's the one that the whole of St. Petersburg has been talking about. He's the one, you have to find him." That was totally normal for the time period. Just like today we might say, "Don't you know this yoga teacher?" Everyone goes running to them. Spiritualism was in vogue everywhere at the time. Niklaus let his wife have her way. He was sensitive to those in his family, but lacked a feel for the mood of the Russian people. He ignored the fact of the proletariat workers in the big city. These were not the good peasants who liked the Tsar and prayed to God. They were the new men of the new Russia, which was evolving towards socialism, like all other countries did. He did not understand that things had changed. The Romanovs reigned ostentatiously as ever, removed from society, in an illusionary world of absolute rule. They were oblivious to the hardships of their subjects. The St. Petersburg court was considered one of the most magnificent of its time, with 15,000 servants. Everybody else had one or two things. They had 10 of them, whatever they were. They had a huge number of palaces. They had a huge amount of people looking after them. Everything was sort of double, 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 double. Queen Victoria used to look upon the Tsar and say, "Frightful Russians, they always overdo everything." The British relatives turned their noses up. Nevertheless, in May 1913, 3 cousins met in Berlin. British King George V, the German Emperor Wilhelm II, and the Russian Tsar Nicholas II. They celebrated the wedding of the Emperor's daughter to the Duke of Brunswick. It was the last time they saw each other. They were connected by family, but were political rivals. Under the pet names Willie and Nicky, the Emperor and Tsar had been writing to each other in English for years. In 1914, Europe was plunged into a crisis partly due to their actions. Only when it was too late did they remember their family ties. Wilhelm wrote to his cousin on the 29th of July 1914 that they had to prevent this most terrible war that was threatening Europe. 3 days later, the First World War began. Modern technology turned it into a mass slaughter. In addition to the losses on the front line, at home there was famine. People of Russia blamed the Tsar for this, and his German wife. From both the intelligentsia and the military, right down to simple peasants, everyone talked about Tsar Nicholas and his family. He tended towards mystical ideas and obeyed his wife's commands. The state was ruled by the Tsarina, who in turn was controlled by a certain Camarilla, which included the dodgy Siberian peasant Rasputin. The wildest rumors spread about him. It was said that the Tsar's court was completely under his spell. From circles close to the Tsar, Felix and Irina Yusupov wanted to put an end to the situation.
They had come to the conclusion that the Tsarina was totally under the influence of Rasputin. When she also interfered in politics and began to change ministers, it became dangerous. That's why my grandfather and the others decided to make Rasputin disappear.
On the evening of the 30th December 1916, the conspirators used an excuse to lure Rasputin to the Yusupov's palace under a pretense to get him out of the way once and for all. It was no easy task. The guest was served poisoned wine, but instead of dying, he begins to sing. He was shot in the back but staggered away. The poisoned man was tied up and thrown into the river. The perpetrators were never punished. Most contemporaries regarded the murder as a patriotic act.
As my grandfather was married to Tsar's niece, the Tsar couldn't put him in prison. My grandparents were sent to the Crimea. That saved them, because they were very far away from the capital when the revolution broke out.
St. Petersburg in March 1917. Thousands took to the streets for bread and reforms. The demonstrators were joined by rebelling regiments of the Imperial army. A few days later, the generals urged their Tsar to abdicate the throne. Nicholas II abdicated on the 15th of March, 1917. I don't think he was a very strong character, and if you combine that with his attitude of, I am, you know, appointed by God to lead my people, that's pretty big pressure on a shoulder. He wasn't really up to it. He was a rigid man. He was the wrong man in the wrong place at the wrong time, I suppose you could say. After the abdication, the Tsar's family was initially imprisoned in an Alexander Palace at the gates of St. Petersburg. Their most loyal servants did not leave their side, even 5 months later when the family was transferred to Tobolsk in Siberia. There, the Tsar's daughter, Maria, wrote in her diary,
"We are all healthy. We walk around the farm a lot and go sledging in the mountains."
The Tsar still thought that in the future, after the end of the war, he could retire with his family to Crimea and live a sort of normal life in Crimea. That was an illusion. In a coup d'etat in November 1917, the Bolsheviks seized power under Lenin's leadership. This began a time of terrors. During the Russian Civil War, with the Reds fighting against the Whites, a spiral of violence escalated throughout the country that can hardly be put into words. There were attacks against different population groups, assassinations of Tsarist generals and aristocrats, with everyone turned against each other. And Lenin fought against the old regime. He hated the Tsar. His brother tried to assassinate his father and was executed for it. Lenin himself was banished to Siberia for 3 years for contributing to an illegal underground newspaper. Now, his hour had come. He had the Tsar's family deported to Yekaterinburg in the Urals, 2,500 kilometers east of St. Petersburg. The Tsar's family and their servants were placed under arrest in the Ipatiev house. The Bolsheviks labeled it as a house for special use. Shortly after midnight, on the 17th of July 1918, a loud banging at the door awoke the family's personal physician, Dr. Botkin. The family and their servants were forced to move into the cellar for their own protection, for fear of gunfire in the city during the night. It took half an hour for everyone to dress and gather in the basement. The air was cool, so they had dressed in travelling clothes. They were also told they may be moved out. They walked quietly downstairs, the daughters and the chambermaid holding cushions in their hands, within which jewellery was hidden. 11 people were taken to the cellar of the Ipatiev house that night. Commander Yurovsky had them line up in a row, as he often organised them during roll calls. Each morning, he would check in this way whether everyone was present. Therefore, this did not seem unusual. Then, the commander told the Tsar that the government had decided to execute them. Wild gunfire broke out. People were running all over the place. It was a bloodbath. The massacre lasted several minutes. A few bullets ricocheted off the jewellery sewn into the cushions, but nothing could stop the murderers that night. Suddenly, Anastasia's voice and her moans could be heard. It turned out that she was still alive. There was a huge bayonet on the rifle, and ultimately, this is what she was killed with. When everything seemed to be over, the little Tsarevich suddenly regained consciousness. They put the pistol to his forehead. With this shot, the entire Tsarist family was wiped out. In the following days, members of the Romanov family were hunted down all over Russia. 18 members of the dynasty and a number of the others from their circle fell victim to the Bolsheviks. They tried to murder as many as they could, except a good part of these who were in Crimea. And that part was, luckily for them, my father's and my grandfather's. The British King George V sent a battleship to rescue the persecuted, including the Tsar's mother. When eventually they did move away from Yalta, there was another boat full of Imperial soldiers who were being taken to Sevastopol to fight. And as they passed the Tsarina, they sang the Imperial anthem. It's a very impressive piece of music with these Russian voices. You know how the Russian choirs sing, and the whole ship was singing that. And it was the last time that that was ever played in front of a member of the Imperial family. The Tsar's mother, Maria Fyodorovna, she was never to know the fate of her son. She never wanted people to talk about it, because she believed all the time, no, it cannot be. Maybe something has happened. Maybe it's not true. Or to put it another way, hoping for the impossible. The Tsar's mother lived in Copenhagen, in this wishful belief until her death. Prince Dmitri also made his home there. It's becoming a bit too difficult to understand how a thing like that could happen. I mean, again, you kill a president for political reasons, but a whole family? No, come on. You don't do that. But they did that. Under the Soviets, the fate of the Tsar's family was kept quiet. In 1978, the geologist Alexander Avdonin secretly set out on a search. We knew that the poet Vladimir Mayakovsky had been in Yekaterinburg in the 1920s and had seen the secret place where the bones were. He then wrote his famous poem, The Emperor. It ends with the words, "A road runs through the place where the emperor lies." They tried to burn them, and they tried to dissolve them with acid, but it didn't work. So they went off to find somewhere better to bury them. Then somebody had the idea. It's very near the railway line. So they took the railway line sleepers. They put the bodies in the ground, they put the sleepers on top, and they drove the truck backwards and forwards to bury them. Alexander Avdonin's clandestine excavations lasted a year. In 1979, he discovered 3 human skulls, a dangerous find. We put the skulls together with a sacred painting in the box, dug a hole and put the box in there at night. We didn't say a word about it for 12 years. With the fall of the Soviet Union, the silencing of the Tsar's fate also ended. At the request of President Yeltsin, the remains of the Tsar's families and their servants were exhumed in 1991. A DNA analysis of the artifacts removed any last doubts. We took blood samples from family members, from Prince Dmitry Romanov, from Prince Nicholas Romanov, even from Prince Philip, the husband of the British Queen. As another relative, he was one of the most important people in our investigation. In 1998, the remains of the Tsar's family and their servants were laid to rest in St. Petersburg in a ceremonial act of state. The Queen gave permission for certain officers to go to the burial of the Tsar in 1998 in St. Petersburg, including the Pipe Major. And when the coffins were being taken from the aeroplane to the cars to the hearses, the lone piper was playing. And the tune he was playing was a lament, and it was called Coming Home.
and it is called cunning.
And we stood there, and with us was the grandson of the doctor who was murdered in Yekaterinburg. He was right by me on his knees. The coffin of his grandfather was passing. That, suddenly, historical event became something really happening to us, to me, to Russia. The man came to see his coming home of his grandfather. The victims of Yekaterinburg were laid to rest in the St. Peter and Paul Cathedral, the landmark of the former Tsarist capital. In the presence of their descendants, former President Boris Yeltsin bowed to the last Tsar and his family. The bloodbath of Yekaterinburg is one of the most shameful moments of our history, recalls Yeltsin. With the funeral, we want to atone for the guilt of our ancestors. The fact that Yeltsin was there, political calculation or otherwise, asking for forgiveness on behalf of Russia for what was done to our family, and that, of course, we have never forgotten.
And that, of course, we never forgotten.
That was one of the most nightmarish days, but also one of the happiest, because they are now resting in peace.
90 years after their murder, the Tsar's family were rehabilitated as victims of communist violence. The whole way that history has moved forward from the Romanovs to Lenin, to Stalin, and now to the present regime has been a sort of continuous row of history. In the Russian eyes, it was an evolutionary thing. It was part of the way that Russia came forward. They've been through such hell, and they've come through it. They've come through it with pride, with strength, and they have resilience. And they have a word in Russian, which means the ability to get on with it, the ability to cope. Nachodzewish means being able to get on with it, and I find that very admirable. The legacy of the Tsars is still visible in countless places in Russia today. The Russian people are beginning to rediscover the history of the Romanovs in search of paths into the future.